Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Kendra Smiley and I am the Statewide Family Engagement Center Director. And here with us tonight, I have Becky. Becky, pronounce her last name for me. I always mutilate it.
Goetzinger.
Goetzinger, with the National Center from Families Learning. And she is so kind to put together this webinar for everyone tonight on the foundational skills in reading. As Becky had mentioned earlier, for those of you that were already on the call, everyone is muted. We have Clay from NCFL. If you have any issues with technology, he is there to help us with that component. And so throughout the presentation, if you have questions or comments, if you just want to type them in the chat box, Clay will help monitor those. And then once Becky is all complete and done, we'll open it up for questions to where Clay will help unmute you if you have a question. So take it away, my friend.
Thanks, Kendra. All right. As Kendra said, my name is Becky Goetzinger. I am the reading specialist at the National Center for Families Learning. And while we do have an office in Arizona, I'm actually based at our headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm coming to you this evening from my kitchen in Louisville. So welcome everyone to my home. My background is as a classroom teacher. Before I came to NCFL 3 years ago, I taught for 24 years. I always mess this up. I think I have 17 years in kindergarten, first or second grade, and then 5 years in middle school as a reading specialist, and then 2 years at the high school level as a literacy coach. And then additionally, I've also worked as an education professor for one of our local universities, teaching reading methods courses. So I have a lot of background and I'm happy to be here this evening to share some stuff with you. So we have 4 learning outcomes for our time together this evening. I'm going to try and increase your knowledge of foundational skills in reading. Notice I say increase. I'm sure many of the things I'm going to tell you tonight you already know. So for some of you, this will just be a refresher. My hope is that people always pick up 1 or 2 new nuggets. We're going to talk about and explore phonological awareness and what that is and what that looks like in our classrooms. We're going to identify some effective strategies for teaching phonics, and then we're going to discuss one specific strategy for teaching vocabulary. So first of all, think about what are foundational skills. When you think about the word foundation, I typically think of the foundation of a house. It's the basis on which something else is built. And when we talk about foundational skills in reading, that's what we're talking about. The term foundational skills actually comes from the Common Core state standards. When the standards were originally written, there were 3 sets of reading standards. There was a set of literary text standards, there was a set of expository text standards, and then there was a 3rd set of standards that did not initially get a whole lot of attention called the foundational skills. As states have decided to move away from the Common Core, different states have done different things. In some states, the foundational skills are now embedded, but in the state of Arizona, you still do have 3 separate sets of standards. So there is a whole foundational skills document, and that includes the very basic skills that kids need to learn to read. They include things like rhyming, alphabet recognition, sound letter correspondence, and sight word fluency. So for our time together this evening, we're going to focus on some of those foundational skills and how we can teach those. This is a graphic that I've created when I talk to folks about the components of reading instruction. The National Reading Panel identified 5 areas for reading, and then some additional research has added a 6th area. And so the 5 areas identified by the National Reading Panel are phonological awareness, which has to do with sound, phonics, which is the relationship between sound and print, vocabulary, which we're going to explore a little bit this evening, which are the words that we know, fluency, which people sometimes miscategorize as reading speed. It's actually reading accuracy along with automaticity, speed, and porosity or expression. Comprehension is our ability to understand the text that we read. And then surrounding all of that is knowledge development. It doesn't matter how good I am at the 5 things in the middle. If I know nothing about carburetors, I am really going to struggle to read a piece on how to repair a carburetor. So you have to have some knowledge around whatever topic that you're reading in order to be able to do all those other things effectively. So first, we're going to talk about phonological awareness. Phonological awareness, and I always try and quote the research when I'm defining things, is the ability to pay attention to, identify, and reflect on various sound segments of speech. And that definition comes out of words their way. And so it's a broad umbrella term, and it includes phonemic awareness. If you look at the original National Reading Panel documents, they talked about phonemic awareness, not phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is the broader term, and so I prefer to focus on it because phonemic awareness is just one tiny part of that. And so I have a graphic that I'm going to share with you to show you what phonological awareness is, and then I'm going to give you an example of each thing just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So one phonological awareness skill are rhyming words. When we talk about phonological awareness, I can't say it enough times, we're talking about sound. So asking a child to know that the word hand rhymes with the word band, not seeing those words written, but simply hearing them and knowing that they're rhyming words. Or if I said ask you to identify a word that rhymed with cat and you were able to generate 4 or 5 words that rhymed with cat, all done orally. Another phonological awareness skill is alliteration. When we think of alliteration, people often think of poetry, words that begin with the same letter. When we're talking about alliteration in phonological awareness, we're talking about words that begin with the same sound. So if I ask a student, if I said balloon, balloon starts with a b, b. Can you name other words for me that start with a b sound? That's alliteration when we're talking about phonological awareness. Counting the syllables in words. I'm sure most of you are familiar with clapping the syllables in words. Computer. So we're not talking about all the fancy rules yet for open and closed syllables, simply that kids can identify the number of syllables in a spoken word. That's phonological awareness. Counting the number of words in a sentence. This one I find is often neglected and is really important if we're working with early childhood students or even kindergarten students, and we want them to master one-to-one match when they're reading. They have to be able to count the number of words in a sentence. And so we should do that orally before we ask kids to start reading. So if I wanted to say, my cup is full of water, I'm truly just asking students to count the number of words in that sentence. So my cup is full of water. And for them to identify that that sentence has 6 words in it. That's a phonological awareness skill. Onset and rhyme, it's a skill that has to do with rhyming words, helping kids to recognize that cat, bat, sat all have the same rhyme, the at sounds, but the onset is what we're changing in those. And so again, we're not talking about letters yet. We're not talking about writing out words yet. We're just asking kids to hear that and to be able to orally recognize those word parts. And then there's this whole other chunk of phonological awareness called phonemic awareness. And so all of the other phonological awareness skills fall under this umbrella. So in all of the things that I've talked about, we're not segmenting words into individual sounds yet. So in rhyming words, we're looking at whole words. Alliteration, we're just looking at one particular sound. Syllables, we're clapping word parts. Words in a sentence, we're counting whole words. onset and rhyme, we're talking about word parts again. Phonemic awareness, we're looking at individual speech sounds and words. And so there are multiple skills that fall under phonemic awareness. The first one is the isolation of sounds, for kids to be able to take a word and to isolate a beginning, middle, or ending sound. So if I say pen, asking a child to be able to isolate the beginning sound. What sound does pen begin with? It begins with a P sound. Again, I can't emphasize enough that we're talking about sounds, not letters. So just for the child to know that pen starts with a P, whether or not they know what letter represents that sound. The blending of sounds. So for me to orally state sounds and ask a student to blend them together. K, a, t. If you slide together the sounds, k, a, t, what word does that make? I used to always teach students to actually slide them on their arm. So k, a, t, cat. And so we're talking about blending the sounds together to make words. Segmenting of sounds. So once you can isolate sounds and identify like the beginning sound in pen, the next step is to actually isolate the individual sounds. So what are the 3 sounds you hear in pen? Or a really good example, what are the sounds you hear in phone? Because in phone, there are 5 letters. There are only 3 sounds, fa, o, n. And so that's a really good example to illustrate for us that we're not talking about letters here. We're not talking about spelling. We're simply encouraging students to hear sounds and words. And then the last one is my favorite because I think it's fun. It's wordplay, the addition, deletion, or substitution of sounds. So asking you to say cup without the k would be up, or say pen but change the beginning sound to men. And so I think those have a lot of interesting applications, and I think kids tend to find those to be very fun. So I'm going to give you 3 phonemic awareness strategies. They're things that you can use in classrooms. Again, none of them use letters and none of them use words. So they often do use manipulatives or pictures just because that allows us to make students more independent. We don't have to do all the activities with us sitting and talking to them. So this is an example of a phonemic awareness sort where we're asking students to isolate sounds. You can create sorts that focus on beginning, middle, or ending sounds. As a classroom teacher, I used to always create my own. A lot of times you can find them commercially prepared, but they tend to have the letters associated with them, and then they become phonics sorts, not phonemic awareness sorts. So more appropriate for K1 students, whereas this particular sort could be done by 4-year-olds. You'll notice on the side where it says sample, it says initial k and initial l, and there's slashes there. And those hash marks show that I'm talking about the sound, not the letter. And so kids would just cut these pictures out and then they would sort them into 2 groups. You'll notice that at the top, kangaroo and lion are my kind of target sounds, and that they have a gray bar there to help students see that those are the sounds that they're trying to match. So like I said, you can find lots of these that are commercially prepared. But once you put a letter to them and not just pictures, then you're doing phonics, whereas this is just isolating sounds for phonemic awareness. Another activity is to use blocks or manipulatives, and truly when families are at home, you can teach parents to do this with Cheerios or Goldfish crackers or whatever they have in their house. But starting with CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant words that are short and simple, and saying a sound for each letter, and then asking students to blend those sounds together. So for example, duh, aw, g. If we push those blocks together, what would it say? Duh, aw, g. And for students to blend the sounds and push the blocks together and say dog. Typically, if I'm doing activities like that, I'll say the sounds first and tap, and then I'll ask students to say the sounds and tap. And while students are home, I think this is the kind of thing that parents can be encouraged to do, and that most parents probably could do. Another activity for teaching sounds, for teaching phonemic awareness, are Alconin boxes. Alconin boxes can also be used in phonics, but the way we're using them this evening, there are no letters. So this is a phonemic awareness activity. Again, typically start with CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant words. That's what students typically learn first. And then to say each sound and push the chips. These little green circles are meant to be chips or manipulatives. So I would ask students to say duh, aw, g, dog. And so getting them to separate the sounds. If this one happened to have a picture of a phone on it, there would still only be 3 boxes because phone only has 3 sounds. I have commercially prepared sets of Alconin boxes. You can get them with 2 blocks for words that have 2 sounds, like ice. This one is a 3 block. You can get them with 4 or 5 blocks. But again, it's the kind of thing that you can make yourself or you can find online as well. So really important when we're talking about phonological awareness, we're talking about activities that are done orally using pictures or manipulatives. We're not talking about letters or words. Super, super important to realize that there's a whole set of skills that kids need to develop before we get too focused on letter recognition. They can be taught simultaneously, but it's really helpful if kids have some of these skills up front. Typically, phonological awareness is mastered by the end of 1st grade. So if you look at the state standards, and specifically Arizona, since we have so many friends on from Arizona this evening, you'll notice that the standards are only in kindergarten and 1st grade for phonological awareness. However, it doesn't mean we don't teach phonological awareness to older kids. If we have struggling readers in 2nd and 3rd grade who really just are not getting it, then we might need to go back and teach some of these skills. If a 3rd grade student can't count the number of words in a sentence, they're probably not going to be able to do one-to-one correspondence when we ask them to read a book. And so it's really important that we find what I call the holes in the Swiss cheese and figure out what kids are missing and go back and teach those skills. Because I know most of you are doing distance learning right now, I thought it was important to include some ideas for you. So to teach phonemic awareness during distance learning, using chants or finger plays or rhymes that families can not necessarily read, but things that you can encourage families just to recite or chant. If you have any opportunities to do virtual meetings with your class, you could do a different one every week and ask families to practice it throughout the week. You can assign families scavenger hunts based on sounds. I have a friend here in Kentucky who is a 4-year-old preschool teacher, and this is one of the assignments she's been giving her students every week. She gives them a sound, and they have to take pictures of things in their house that begin with that sound and send them to her. So it's important to note, though, that phone would go under F, because even though it starts with the letter P, we're talking about sound here. So phone starts with a F sound. And so being really cognizant that that's a sound hunt, not a letter hunt, and really emphasizing that to parents. If you're sending home packets, you can send home picture sorts like the example that I've shown. At the end of tonight's webinar, I'm going to ask you to complete a feedback form, and anybody who completes that will get some free resources, including the picture sort that I showed you tonight. And then if you're looking for things for students to do online, Professor Garfield is free, and it has different games on it to teach blending, deletion, and substitution, which are all phonemic awareness skills. I'll caution you that I've heard a lot of complaints from parents that teachers are asking them for their kids to play games that they don't understand or don't know how to play, Professor Garfield is really simple, and kids don't need any direction. I will caution you that you do need Flash Player on your computer for Professor Garfield to work. So another foundational skill is phonics. Phonics is foundational, but it's not like phonological awareness. It's not just that K-1 preschool space. Students learn phonics starting when they're 4, and typically there are phonics standards even all the way through 5th grade. And so there are lots of different phonics skills besides just the most basic one, which is associating letter with sound. But there are definitely skills for older kids as well. So phonics is a teaching method that connects spoken sounds to written symbols. Phonics should be taught in a very systematic way, and students should learn that even though English is quirky, English is very predictable. When you see an E at the end of a word, typically the E is silent. So that's a very predictable pattern, and students should be able to taught to recognize that pattern. So one of the things that people think of when they think of phonics is decoding. And when you think of decoding, you think of sounding out words, that kids are going to break the code to read words. What people don't realize is there are multiple different ways to teach decoding. One of them is to teach kids to sound out words. I personally don't love sounding out for a lot of words because you'll see that it's not particularly effective. We do individual sounds, we go letter by letter, we go left to right. So m, at, mat. Sounding out is fantastic when we're talking about words like mat that are consonant vowel consonant words. They're super short, they're easy to read. We don't have a whole lot of sounds to blend together. But if I'm trying to blend together a word like somewhere, that's an awful lot of letters to try and slide together. Plus, somewhere is a compound word, and students should be taught to recognize that. That's a phonics skill. But another way to teach kids to decode words is by analogy, and teaching kids that if they come to an unfamiliar word, they can scan from left to right, and they can identify familiar phonograms or letter patterns and then add the additional sounds. So rather than looking at mat as 3 separate sounds, realizing that mat has the phonogram at, and just putting an M on it, mat. So when we teach kids to decode, which we should do very intentionally, typically as part of guided reading groups, we want to teach kids not just to sound things out letter by letter, but there are more than one way to do that. I'm going to go back to the example of phone, which I always keep here by me. Phone, if I try and do that and sound it out letter by letter, it's p, n, e. Doesn't make any sense. So teaching kids to recognize that that PH chunk makes the f sound is a phonics skill. It's actually a digraph. Teaching kids that that E is systematic, that it's silent, that it makes the O long. So helping kids to see that whole pattern and to see all of those things and to recognize that by analogy, I can find some things that I know and not just sound out letter by letter. Carrie asked if another term for analogy is chunking. When I was a classroom teacher, I did call it chunking. But actually, if you look at the definition of chunking, it's actually something completely different. So yes, a lot of teachers do refer to phonics by analogy as chunking. But if you look at the US Department of Ed's definition of chunking, it would be taking mat and reading m, a, mat, m, at, and you add on one letter at a time. So I intentionally didn't call it chunking because that's a term that's used in different ways, whereas decoding by analogy or phonics by analogy is something that's used pretty consistently. So one strategy that you can teach kids to help them recognize, or that you can use to help kids recognize phonograms, are called word ladders. There are lots of different commercially prepared word ladders, but this one is one that I've created myself because I'm specifically focusing on phonograms. And so, again, I said that I would send you an email tomorrow with some of the resources. This slide is actually based on a template by Presentation to Go, and I can actually send you this slide tomorrow. So we're going to see who's awake. If you'll find your chat box, and if you will type really quickly a 3-letter word that is a tool for cleaning the floor. Yay, lots of you are still with me and awake. A 3-letter tool for cleaning the floor is a mop. And so mop goes at the bottom of our word ladder. And we're going to change one sound each time to form a new word. So your next clue is another word for lid. You can only change one letter. What's another word for lid? You guys are super smart. It's top. And so you'll notice that I'm focusing on this op phonogram. What a car does at a red light. Yes, this one is technically 2 sounds, the ST blend, but yes, stop. What a person does at a store. Excellent. Many of you recognize that that one is shop. And then how a rabbit moves. And that's actually an example of a deletion because I'm deleting that S at the beginning. So you can create word ladders like this one that I've done. If you follow Tim Rosinski at all on social media, he's actually been giving away a free word ladder a week since families are stuck at home. I like to stay safe at home. But the reason I like to create them myself is that I can focus on specific phonetic elements that I'm teaching. And you can actually buy them commercially as well. And for younger kids, you can make them with pictures so that they don't have to read the clues. So I could have put pictures here of a mop, a top, a stop sign, a person with a grocery cart, and then a rabbit moving. So there are different ways that you can do it, but it's a way to get kids to focus on looking for the chunks in the words and being able to use analogy. If I know mop, then I know top. So another thing that falls under phonics is sight words. Sight words are high frequency words, typically considered to be the most frequently used words in the English language in print. They're typically words like the, it, who, we, that aren't high meaning words, that aren't easily pictured. But a lot of times we don't teach them intentionally in classrooms. And so it's important that, and there are standards around teaching sight words. And so making sure that we're teaching them holistically. We don't try and sound out the word the. We don't try and read the by analogy. The is just the, and that's a combination of letters that are associated with a sound. And that sound happens to be a whole word. Sight words should be taught intentionally. And I'm going to share some activities and some sight word routines with you this evening. And then sight words should be taught systematically. If you're at a school, you should know that every first grader in your school is going to learn this set of sight words, and every second grader in your school is going to learn this set of sight words. And by 3rd grade, kids should be reading sight word phrases. Sight words are the foundation for fluency. If kids know sight words, then they can become fluent readers. Sight words should be taught in isolation. A lot of the research around sight words actually shows that flashcards are one of the most effective ways to teach sight words. That's really important right now when parents are at home with their kids, because sight word flashcards are something that most parents can practice with kids, and they can do it with a lot of confidence. Kids should also practice sight words in connected text. And so one of the things I used to do were to create my own sight word books as a teacher. If you fill out our feedback form tomorrow, one of the things I'm going to send you is a sample of one of the sight word books that I used to use that's created in Microsoft Word. So when you think about sight words, you want to develop routines in your classroom so that every Monday kids know they're going to get 5 new words or 4 new words or 3 new words. If you're teaching in a preschool, I would say no more than 1 word. it's more important that a 3 or 4-year-old learns letters and phonological awareness and letter sound correspondence than sight words. So typically we think of sight words starting in kindergarten. So 5 words, 4 words, talk about the words. Then maybe the next day kids will know that they're going to learn a chant, or they're going to learn a poem, or they're going to learn a sight word song. A lot of the new reading series actually have sight word songs that go with them. You can also find them on YouTube. If you're creative, you can make them up yourself, but singing and dancing, not my talents. So I used to always find commercially prepared ones as a teacher. Do close activities. Like I said, I'm going to send you an example of a sight word book. Have kids build words, letter tiles, magnetic letters, cut and paste letters. Any of those things work. And right now, while families are at home, if you look at Friday, there are some activities there that families can do at home. If families have Play-Doh, you can roll the Play-Doh out into snakes and practice spelling words that way. You can take a flat sheet pan and pour some sugar in it, just a little bit, and kids can practice with their finger like they would do for a sand tray. Rainbow words, we're talking about writing just lots of different colors. Again, since I know most of you have kids at home, one of the things I'm going to share, I used to make tic-tac-toe boards for families around sight words, and I would give them a list of words to practice, and then there would be 9 activities on a tic-tac-toe board. So that's another one of the things that I'm going to share with folks. Someone said, can you give the name of that person again? Yes, the person that I was talking about for the word letters is Tim Rosinski. I think I spelled his last name right. I just put his name in the chat box for you. I think it's on Twitter that he actually has several sight word books that Scholastic has published. And so he's been releasing a free one every week that's a printable for teachers. You're welcome. So sight words are important. We know that kids who learn sight words early tend to excel in reading. Not only do they excel in fluency, but kids who learn sight words tend to also excel in comprehension because they can read more quickly and they have to stop and figure out fewer words. So that's really important. All right, so some phonics ideas for distance learning. I'll keep going. So assign sight word lists and give families fun activities like sidewalk chalk. Families can play memory games. I used to have kids play one called high 5 words. You truly just take an index card or a sticky note and parents write the word on it and they hang it around the house. And every time the kid passes it, they high 5 the word and say what it says. So that's a really fun one that families and kids tend to like. If you're doing packets, like I said, word letters are available online. You can get them commercially or you can make your own. Assigning families to do word building activities. Word building activities are fun, not just for little kids, but for older kids as well. While I'm talking, see if you can figure it out. The words and the letters in the bracket spell one word. And so adults like to play with those words as well. This particular set of letters would allow kids to practice short A words, short E words, the long A with a silent E pattern, and then the long EE spelling pattern. So it can get a lot of bang for your buck with a first grader or second grader who needs to practice vowel sounds. So my word there is elephants. And so I tend to find that adults like to figure those out. If you're looking for online games for kids to play that you can recommend to families, readwritethink.org has lots of free online games around alphabet recognition and letter sound correspondence. If you're not familiar with readwritethink.org, the major literacy organizations sponsor that together. So families can find things, but teachers can also find lesson plans there. I'm going to keep going because I'm trying to be cognizant of my time, and we'll save questions for the end. And we're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary. I'm only going to give you one strategy this evening for vocabulary, and it's because one that I think is important, and it's one that we can do right now. Collectively, vocabulary refers to words that we hear and understand, the words that we use when we're speaking, words that we can identify and understand in text, and words that we use when we're writing. If a person can do all of those things, then something is truly part of their vocabulary. A word is truly part of their vocabulary. When we talk about vocabulary instruction, there are 3 tiers of vocabulary instruction. You may be familiar with the work of Beck, McCowan, and Kukin, but they said that there are 3 tiers of vocabulary. Tier 1 are our basic speaking vocabulary. It's the words that most kids come to school knowing that we never have to teach. We don't have to teach most kids what the word phone means. Most kids know what the word phone means. We don't have to teach kids mom or dog or cat. Most kids come to school with that vocabulary. They know what it means. Elaborated speaking vocabulary. When I talk about that, I like to talk about synonyms. So think about pretty. And our elaborated speaking vocabulary are all those other fancy words that mean pretty, like beautiful and gorgeous. And so those are words we do want to teach kids because we want kids to know that you don't have to say said every time, that you can say stated or exclaimed or questioned. And then also there's academic vocabulary. That's stuff that's specific to subject matter. But when we're talking about little kids, academic vocabulary is also structure and how we put words together, and then in English, the subject typically comes before the verb, and helping kids to understand those structures. That's part of academic vocabulary. And so one of the most effective ways to build academic vocabulary with our youngest students is through read-alouds. And so reading aloud to kids, reading books that are very rich in the words that they offer, and asking questions where kids have opportunities to practice language themselves. So when we read aloud with students, we want to use open-ended prompts that allow kids lots of opportunities to think about things, to help kids realize that things don't always have one right answer. And so examples of open-ended prompts include predicting. What do you think is going to happen next? Why do you think he did that? Problem solving. What do you think Tommy is going to do? And hypothesizing. So if you were in the story, what would you do? Those open-ended prompts can be used before, during, and after reading. I'm emphasizing reading aloud because I think it's a thing that we can all do during distance learning. I don't know about in Arizona, but here in Kentucky, everybody is reading aloud. I was on my Twitter feed today, and the local university every Tuesday has a different student athlete reading a picture book aloud to kids. And today it was one of their student golfers. We have, celebrities reading books aloud. Michelle Obama is now reading aloud every Monday. That's all great. But a lot of the people who are reading aloud just read the book. And so as educators, it's really important that we model for parents that when we read aloud, we don't just read the book. When we read aloud, we stop and we talk and we ask questions, and we encourage kids to think and to interact with the text. So if you have an opportunity to read aloud to your students during distance learning, I really encourage you that even though students might not be able to answer you, to pause and to ask those questions, to model for parents what really high quality reading aloud looks like. During read-alouds, I have a list here of things adults can do and things that children can do. It's really important that as adults, we extend children's language when we read aloud. If we ask a question and a child just gives us a 1 or 2 word answer, to really push them for a complete sentence and ask them to really think about what that could look like. And then children, when we read aloud in a classroom, it shouldn't just be the one kid raising their hand to answer the question. I always encourage teachers that when we're reading aloud to assign kids an elbow partner, and so that every time you ask a question, every child has the opportunity to answer that question with a partner, and then one or two people can share with the whole group. But when we're reading aloud to intentionally build vocabulary, that requires a little bit more planning on our part as educators. It means picking out words ahead of time that we're going to focus on, thinking about what pictures in the book are really well illustrated and can really help us with academic vocabulary, and reading books that are really rich in subject matter vocabulary. So reading books that are nonfiction science text, reading stories that incorporate science concepts or geography concepts, and pointing out new words. And there's a really interesting study by Kendall, which I've cited here, that if when we read, we just pause to point out a few words, give students a definition, provide students with a synonym or give them an example, and then we follow that up with some kind of activity, it's actually been shown to actually improve students' vocabulary. Those words stick. So it's not just the random running through the book, but it's intentionally focusing on a few words, picking out one or two words that we're going to talk about before, during, and after reading. And it's a very intentional way that we can transfer vocabulary, at least into students' listening vocabulary, and hopefully eventually to their speaking vocabulary. When I talk about reading aloud, I feel like I always have to at least pause and talk about choosing text for reading aloud. I like to encourage people to read nonfiction. I like to encourage parents to read nonfiction. Kids hear a whole lot of stories, and they don't hear enough nonfiction text. It's just not as comfortable for most people to read aloud. Make sure the books that we're reading have interesting language. If I'm reading a level A guided reading text that has 2 words on a page, it's probably not the best book for a read aloud because it doesn't have a lot of interesting language in it. Thinking about the design and layout, I love those DK books that let you explore a castle or talk about the parts of whatever critter, but they're not really practical for read alouds because they have a lot of little text and a whole lot of different little pictures. So really looking at the design and layout of the books that you're choosing to read aloud for students. I think that's especially important if you're recording read alouds now because kids have to be able to see the pictures on camera. Representation, making sure that the books we read are accurately depicting people, that we're representing a cross-section of people in the books that we choose to read aloud, and that we're not continuing stereotypes by choosing books that depict people in stereotypical ways. Making sure books are accurate. It's amazing that books are still published that have factual errors in them, or that have errors in vocabulary, but there are examples of books that have been published by very well-known authors, children's books that actually have mistakes in them. So look for accuracy in the content that you're choosing. And look for books that have content connections. If we're talking about academic vocabulary, if I can read a math book that has the word sum in it, when I'm teaching students addition, that just adds on another layer. And it really helps kids to see, the vocabulary that we're trying to teach in multiple ways. A couple of vocabulary ideas for distance learning. Like I said, modeling interactive read-alouds for our families via video conferencing, or if you can record it and send the recording to families so that families see that reading isn't just reading every word and turning the pages, but that reading is really interactive and rich. Focusing on your students' hobbies or interests. All of your students have things that they love and they know all of the vocabulary related to that thing. So letting kids do projects and create mini dictionaries around their passion, and letting families choose the format that works best for them. They can either video or draw or do PowerPoint slides or whatever fits with the families that you work with. But letting kids create their own mini dictionaries that they can share. And then PBS Kids, if you're looking for an online tool that you can just recommend to families, PBS Kids has online stories and games that are intentionally set up to build students' vocabulary. All right. So we have 10 minutes left for feedback and questions. Marta was saying that Flash Player may be discontinued for some browsers. It actually has about 6 more months. I actually looked that up before I recommended Professor Garfield to you. So I think Flash Player has a few more months. And so hopefully you can get it to work. I will say that it did take a little bit of tech skill on my part to get Flash Player and Professor Garfield working. So if you're worried that families don't have high tech skills, I would not recommend that one. But you do have about I think it's about 6 more months before Flash goes away.
All right, Heather here has a question. I went ahead and unmuted her. So Heather, what do you have for us?
I found it, I'm sorry. I don't have a question.
No problem, Heather. Somebody was asking if Kentucky has many language learners. Yes, I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and in our local school district, we have 120 different languages spoken. So in any particular school, we have many students who do not speak English as their dominant language. All right. So I think we'll end it there. Thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. I'm so glad that you were able to spend a little bit of time with us and that we were able to work a little bit late this evening to provide some support for all of our friends out in Arizona.